Welcome to Fun Palais Podcast, where we are unpacking opinions and changing destinations. I am your host, Sherley, where each week we will chat about how to rise strong out of all types of obstacles that come with relationships. Through personal life experiences and discussions ranging from infidelity, trust, forgiveness, sex, heartbreak, self-love, and so much more. I am passionate and obsessed to provide guidance to every woman to create a better life. Let's dive in, pull up a seat, make sure you're cozy, and get ready to be challenged and encouraged while you learn. With me, your virtual girlfriend. Welcome to another episode of Fun Palais Podcast, and today for story time, we do have a special guest with us. We have a dear friend who I have worked with as a flight attendant. We work with the same company, and we have Dr. Sarah Tuberty. Did I say that right?
Yes,
Very
absolutely.
good. Thank you very much, because I'm not good with last names. The reason why she's so dear to me is because number one, I found out when we were working the trip that she had her doctorates, and that is very fascinating to me. I think as flight attendants, we do a lot, but she was very modest about it. And I was, of course, being stalking on her podcast website and looking at all her information. And I think I was sitting on the jump seat and I immediately, I don't know what we were doing. And I sent her a text. I'm like, "You're a doctor?" She was like, "Yes, I do have my doctorate." And she was so modest about it. And don't get me wrong, I feel like when you have all the education and the accolades in the world, you should be very proud. But I feel like there are some people that overthrow it in your face. And Sarah was just modest about it. "Yes, I have my doctorate. Thank you very much." And, that's it. She doesn't throw anything in anybody's face. Not only that, this woman has multiple streams of income because not only does she have her doctorates in clinical occupational therapy, right? Am I saying it right, Sarah?
Yes.
Okay. And
Yeah.
she is also doing area yoga. She is also a flight attendant. And then she has another job. So, you know what? She is set. Set. I love it. So, enough about me like boosting her up. I'm going to pass her the mic so she can tell you more about herself before she gets into her story. So, Sarah, welcome. And you can add on to the stuff that I said.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here. And it was such a fun trip that we really just clicked as we were in the galley. And you're working with a crew and you're kind of trying to vibe with them. But as we were talking about different things we were interested in, we then were just like, "Wait, you have a podcast? I have a podcast. Let's talk more about this." And there was times when it was like, "Okay, flight attendants prepare for landing." And we're like, "No, I want to continue this conversation." So I just am so excited to be here and to really have all of these conversations, which is so fun. And I love that about flight attending too, and that we're meeting all different people from all different places of the world that are doing all sorts of different things. So I really enjoy that. But yes, that's correct. I have a doctorate in occupational therapy. And it is a clinical degree that is sort of the equivalent of like a judicial doctorate or a medical doctorate. And it is the highest level of education that someone could get presently in occupational therapy. And occupational therapy is so amazing. It's part of the rehab sciences. And it really is a whole profession that is about identifying what it is that people want to engage in. And the big tagline for OT is meaningful activities. It's all like activity based and function based. And then really working with somebody that maybe has encountered any type of like limitation or injury or anything that's developed that's really preventing them from doing that meaningful occupation. And occupational therapists can work in tons of different settings. I think typically when you imagine an occupational therapist, you might see or you might imagine somebody that's working in a school for people who maybe are on the developmental delay spectrum or on the autism spectrum, or you might imagine an occupational therapist working in a hospital setting. Maybe somebody is coming out of a hip replacement and they're really wanting to get back to work, so really beginning those job training skills, finding adaptive ways for getting in and out of the bed, getting in and out of showering, all those types of things while maintaining those hip precautions. Those are all things that OTs can do, which is really fun. So things that I do in occupational therapy is I'm working right now in 3 jobs. I have 3 jobs. One of them is a flight attendant. Absolutely, we know that. And then I work as a community-based occupational therapy. I'm not. My title is not an occupational therapist at the Philadelphia School of Circus Arts, but I'm using all of my skills and that perspective to bring to the table, like, what are the limitations within the Philadelphia School of Circus Arts that's preventing people who identify within the disability community from having access to doing circus. And that's totally
Mhm.
within the scope of occupational therapy. It's a leisure activity. It's things that can provide all sorts of wonderful spaces of community connection, of like self-esteem, of being able to come in and work on something that's hard, of doing something that's like pleasure and enjoyment and a leisure activity. So I'm working as the accessibility coordinator there to just help broaden how we both all of the things. So both how we teach our classes to be more accessible for people that identify within the disability community, and then looking on what are changes that we can make within the equipment that we have, what are additional supports that we can bring in to make the equipment that we have accessible, what is new equipment that we can order and build that will be more accessible for people, and then what is the environmental space of the actual school. It's an older building and it's beautiful, but there are some elements to it that are not presently accessible. So what are modifications that we can do within the building itself to just create more access, knowing that
Mhm.
there's no space that is 100% accessible for every human that is going to come into the space. But we're really working towards trying to make it as accessible as possible. And then I work as a occupational therapist that's per diem. So that means I'm in a couple times a month to the Shriners Hospital in Philadelphia. And that's working with kids that have both acquired injuries, congenital differences, or just anything sort of developmentally. They specialize in like hand related things. They specialize in spinal cord injuries, I think, at this hospital here. So seeing a lot of that, or posterior spinal fusion. So maybe if somebody had scoliosis, then we sort of rehab and provide different strategies. So when they go home, they're able to do all the things they want to do, knowing how to do them differently well after surgery.
Mhm. I love your story. One thing is I will say you're like the face of like someone I would want my daughter to model. You know, for a long time, I feel like if someone had like two jobs or three jobs, you put in your mind that, oh, they're poor, they can't do much or
Mm-hmm.
they can't do this. And I like how you speak so confidently about it. I have three jobs with no shame attached to it. You're listing everything that you're doing and you're proud of all the lines of work that you're doing, and you have been able to make all three jobs work into your life in a healthy way. And I know you have. If you don't know what per diem means, she's not working 5 days a week. She's not even part time. So it's on an as needed basis, basically. Um, and as a flight attendant, we already know we have a very flexible schedule, especially as we start to, when you've been with the company longer and your seniority starts to get better, the flexibility is magical. So I applaud that about you, because women such as you and myself who have multiple streams of income coming in, 10 years ago, that probably would be frowned upon. But now in like 2022,
Mm-hmm.
it's like everyone has two, three jobs and it's not frowned upon. And I always feel as though you should never close the door of opportunity. That door should always be cracked and you should always be peeking through to see what's the next opportunity you didn't dab into. Of course, Sarah didn't tell us she's going to be working on another doctorate. So, she's furthering her education. And who knows, she
Mm-hmm.
might even have a fourth job within the next 2 years after, or maybe I'll say 3 years, because I don't know how long this doctorate's program is when
Mm-hmm.
she's done. It's just, especially after the pandemic, we all need to wake the fuck up and
Mm-hmm.
realize that one income ain't cutting it. You need to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and plan D. Because if plan A goes away, you need to have something else to tap into. And as a flight attendant, we already know. I was class 1306. You guys have no idea what that means, but in the flight attendant world, they do. And I think it got down to 1310 or 1309 that was furloughed. I was not far away from
Mm-hmm.
basically being furloughed. So I can't sit on this horse and act like I'm untouchable. No, that is not the case. So you always need to have a plan to fall back on, very similar to when something goes disarray when you're traveling, right? And your flight is canceled for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason it may be. You better have plan B ready. Don't be looking at me. I ain't make your plans. Have plan B ready because you never know what's going to happen. And that's just even in your personal life. Thank you,
And bring
Sarah.
snacks.
You are what I want
Always
my
bring
daughter
snacks on
to
airplanes.
see. Yes, bring your own snacks. Bring your own snacks because you ain't missing nothing out. You ain't missing on out on nothing with the snacks that we have. I'm just telling the truth, man. I don't care any airline it was. And you know what? I'm a picky eater. I want my own shit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes,
So,
yes, all of those things.
all right, my
Well, and
dear.
I think it's fun. I think it's fun also that having different jobs means that I'm not in one job long enough to hate it or to become upset with it or feel stagnant with it, in that I am shifting between the different jobs. So every time I enter the new job that that I'm entering that day, it is like I haven't been here for a couple of days. So I'm so excited and I'm fresh and I'm energized. And I really enjoy using each job to break each other. So there are parts of being an occupational therapist that's like really hard and time consuming. I don't think anyone loves documentation, but being an occupational therapist that's PRN, I'm not spending every day writing documentation. And same with flight attending. You know, if I am working every day as a flight attendant, and working through all the cancellations and things like that, that is also very exhausting. So I enjoy having all three of these different jobs where I can do different things in each of those roles. And I feel like each of them is filling a different need that I wouldn't be able to get if they were all just one job.
Absolutely. I was having a conversation with another flight attendant who also, by the way, who's going to school right now. She's getting her master's. She already has her bachelor's. I think she's getting her master's in real estate. And then she is going to go to continue on and become a real estate lawyer. So, this is what I'm telling you. We all out here hustling and doing our thing. And she made the same comment that you make. She realizes the flight attendants who only focus primarily on that are very stressed out. And they're different
Mm-hmm.
from maybe somebody like you, like myself, like her, who are doing different things in a healthy way. And we're not so overstressed and focused on one job. And it breaks up, I guess, it makes your life, I feel, interesting.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a good thing. It's a very much good thing. So we're going to pass you the mic yet again, and you are
Mm-hmm.
going to share your story with us and let them know why you're here today. Why did I want Sarah to come on the show? What does she have to share?
Great. Well, thank you. Yes. So, more about my story. I have a congenital limb difference. And I like the terms congenital limb difference. Congenital means that it was present at birth. And then limb difference means that there is something different about my limb. Limb can both mean upper and lower limbs. So I suppose if you technically it could be I have a congenital upper limb difference, but that feels like lots of words to say. So condensed down congenital limb difference, or sometimes I will say hand difference or congenital hand difference. And hand meaning that there's something different in my hands. This is also a term that's used to describe any type of difference that is from a partial finger all the way up to the shoulder. It could be things that are extra. It could be things that are look different. Maybe all the parts are there, but they're a different shape, or maybe there's parts, but then they don't move as expected. Maybe things are stiff or rotated. Any of those types of possibilities sort of mean limb difference. And there is a big limb different community. If you search or hashtag any of those things on any of the social media channels, you will find a beautiful, vibrant community of all different types of people that identify within the limb difference space. And so with my limb difference, the why is things that people ask all the time, and I don't know. I don't know the why. There isn't a lot of great research or evidence that shares the why as far as why my hand formed this way. My fingers end at the knuckles, and my palm is smaller than my right palm. It's maybe like if we reduced it down in a like if I had a square and then kind of like cut that square down about half the size of that square, I would say that my left palm is about half the size of my right palm in that space. And then I do have a thumb that was surgically created for me when I was 5 years old. I remember everything about that surgery. I remember the color of the couch that my mom slept in. I remember the dream that I had when I was having surgery. I remember them injecting the anesthesia into my arm and having me count backwards from 10. Like I remember very vividly everything about that. And I'm also very thankful that I was a part of that conversation. Both the surgeons and my parents, we talked a lot about what this surgery would mean and if it was something that I wanted. And I was able to contribute and share that it is something I was excited. I didn't totally know what surgery meant, but I was excited to have the possibility of having a thumb. And then I remember like telling my classmates in kindergarten that I had this surgery and that I was really excited to be able to have a thumb, and then was really looking forward to afterwards, like trying to do things with my thumb. And that was very cool. I think it's very important that children are involved in medical decisions being made about them, and that medical decisions should be communicated to them at a level that is developmentally appropriate and in a way that they can understand and access what this means, what are the different types of outcomes of any type of intervention. So whether it's surgery or therapy or any of those different types of things, I believe wholeheartedly in that. And then I did have another surgery prior to that surgery. So my first one, I was 13 months old and was not in a space where I had the conscience to be able to contribute to making a medical decision. And that was a research that was happening in the early 90s. And they were looking at trying to take bones from my toes and transplant them to the tops of my fingers in hopes that maybe these bones would grow a little bit. And then with consecutive surgeries, we could do like bone lengthening surgeries. And the idea was maybe I could get fingers that would come out and be a little bit longer, so I might be able to hold on to a soda can. They're thinking that maybe with that grip, I might be able to get something about that size on my left hand, which was kind of ideal. This surgery tended to not be super successful, and I was part of a research study with lots of different kids that this type of surgery was done on, to a point where my surgeon doesn't necessarily recommend it, in that there's lots of things that happen. The best theory as to why my hand maybe didn't form the way that it was expected to is that there likely was decreased blood flow. So then thinking of surgery, if we're putting something into the body that's at the end, it needs to get nutrients, it needs to get all of the different things to help it survive. So if I'm not getting great blood flow to my hand to begin with, then it's just getting limited nutrients there. And our hands and fingers are the end parts of our body. So if we think about if we're cold, that's going to be the first part of our body that begins to sort of recede getting nutrients as the body's trying to keep the core of the body warmer. So knowing that perhaps maybe that had an effect to it. So I do have little toes as a result of it. I was born with all of my toes, but as a result of the surgery, I have 3 of my toes are like little tiny toes. There's no bones in them. They're kind of wiggly around. Sometimes when I put on heels, the little toes get stuck in my heel, so I have to like bend down and kind of pop them into my heels. But that is my surgical interventions. I then was maintained close contact with my hand surgeon, and then went every year for follow-up visits until I was 16, and just had like really beautiful data to see like how have I been using my hand, what has growth with my hand been like, what are the things that I'm having a hard time with, what are the things that are easy. So that's all just really wonderful, especially for kids that have congenital limb differences, in that it's common but not common enough where like everybody has one, or I was the only kid in my school that had a limb difference, but an hour and a half away was another kid in his school that was the only one with a limb difference. So that really carried me up until my my teens. I did let me see. So other elements in my story that I think are important is that I typically developing, typically, comma, 8-year-olds will have a crisis, if you will, when who are visibly different. They will have this crisis at around 8 years old, because 8 years old is when children are developing their self concepts. So they're understanding who they are and how they fit into the world around them. And they're really being mindful of the messaging that other people are telling them, that they're really mindful of the messaging that they're getting from movies and books and how that impacts them, more so than the messaging that they're getting from the people that they love and the people that they know and the people that love them. Um, so when children that have a visible difference encounter this, they're really starting to hear, from their families are telling them that they're amazing and that there's nothing wrong with them and this is what makes them special, which is great. And but then at the same time, they're beginning to hear messages from the world that is saying things like, your hand is deformed, it's ugly, I don't want to hold it, why does your hand look like that? So in my life as an 8-year-old, I was getting this messaging from people I loved that was like, you're amazing, you're beautiful. But then messaging from the world that was like, you're ugly, don't touch me, don't hold my hand. And that made a really big conflict for me at 8 that I didn't understand. Like, I didn't understand. And I didn't have any language to be able to try to articulate what I was feeling. And I didn't have ways to try to like process and come out of that. So in my life, this crisis was happening at the same time that I started a new school. So I had kids that accepted me when I was 3, because having a hand difference at 3 wasn't that big of a deal. And then I went to grade school with them. And then in 3rd grade, I had an entirely new set of peers that had never seen me before. They never met me before. They didn't know how to talk to me. I didn't know how to talk to them. I had never had a hard time making friendships up until this point in my life. And I didn't feel like I had any allies with me either, in that people who were used to me, and for them to be able to say like, oh, it's cool, she's fine, we can all hang out together. I felt like I was trying to convince kids to be like, no, I'm fine, I can do fun things, but then not really sure how to navigate that. And then being really scared, because I would approach different kids on the playground and they would say no. And like I hadn't had that experience before. And then that's really hard to develop the confidence to walk up to another group of kids and ask if you can play with them, when you know that that group just said no, and that was very
Mm-hmm.
strange and uncomfortable. So that really had a significant impact on me, and I then became very self-conscious. I developed lots of social anxiety, and reading literature about limb differences, talking to people who have limb differences, they talk a lot about these moments of discovery. So my limb difference is it is in a way where I can hide it relatively easily. I can pull my sweatshirt over it. I can have it in my pocket. I can keep it down at my side. So maybe if I'm sitting at a table, I'm eating with my right hand, but my left hand remains in my lap. So I can really kind of try to disguise it, so that people don't discover it. And then there's this like moment of discovery that people have. And then they ask lots of questions, and sometimes it can feel like an interrogation, and you don't know how somebody's going to respond, whether it's going to be a positive thing or a negative thing. All social rules go out the window. I feel like people have asked me a variety of like lots of really deep personal things, where if we were developing a friendship, maybe that would be more appropriate. But if I'm like standing in line behind somebody at the post office, like I'm not going to develop this meaningful connection with that person. And it can feel incredibly emotionally exhausting after that. So I became very much ashamed about my hand, and very much ashamed about being attached to my hand and what my hand meant to me, and really developed this like dislike for my hand, and blamed my hand for a lot of things that were happening in my life, where my hand had nothing to do with it. And
Mm-hmm.
so then in graduate school, I then finally became connected to disability theory and research when I was in my occupational therapy studies, and found that so incredibly powerful, because it helped to give me language to be able to try to go back and understand that experience. So I understand now why at 8 I was having such a hard time making friends, and why I felt so self-conscious. And then lots of messaging on disability is, like, oh, well, you shouldn't let it get to you. And so then there was all this pressure to try to like not let it get to me. And then you feel like you're being a bad disabled person if you're upset about it. And so like there's all of those themes that are happening as well. So it was just really powerful in school to understand that a little bit more. And to read research about myself and about people like me was incredibly empowering. And then realizing that there's this whole like theoretical model of social, the social model of disability, which shares that it's not anything that's wrong with an individual person, but rather the environment that they live in isn't set up for that person to be in it. And that was really powerful too, because so much of the messaging that I'd had up until that point was, what's wrong with your hand? What's wrong with your hand? What's wrong with your hand? And so, well, nothing's wrong with my hand. Like, this is an option of what hands can look like. And
Mm-hmm.
that what's wrong is that pepper grinders use both hands to open them. So if we had accessible pepper grinders, then I could grind pepper on my salad and I wouldn't need to ask somebody for help or use my face. And that's not my problem. That's how pepper grinders are designed problem.
What a nice description you gave us. I wanted to ask you your congenital limb difference. Do you think that's the
Mhm.
reason why you became an occupational therapist?
I do. And that's what I found really attractive about the occupational therapy profession, in that I really loved education. And prior to being a flight
Mm-hmm.
attendant, I had volunteered at a high school and was teaching health classes and loved it. And then I was an AmeriCorps volunteer and was working at a high school in like education support. So I didn't have my own classroom, but I helped, identify and work with kids that maybe weren't doing super great. We did like individualized teaching strategies for them. And I thought it would be really fun to be a science teacher, but then sort of decided that like maybe the classroom environment wasn't where I would fit best. So I became a flight attendant, but then really loved that educational component. And then I really like moving. I tried for a
Mm-hmm.
tiny bit to work at a desk and just get very cranky if I'm sitting at a desk
Mm-hmm.
staring at a screen for a long time. So I really like the movement element, which is why flight attending was so great. Like, we don't have a desk, I don't have a printer, I don't have to email anybody anything. That we're moving both our bodies when we're actually working, but then we're also moving all sorts of different places across the country and around the world. So I knew
Mm-hmm.
that those were things that I liked. I also really enjoy being creative, and I thrive in spaces where I get to create things. So knowing kind of those elements of what makes me happy in jobs and what makes me cranky in jobs, I was using that as I found the title occupational therapy. And then and I was volunteering at Shriners Hospital here in Philadelphia back in like 2013, 2014. And I got called in to help with the OTs. And there was a young woman who had just had a spinal cord injury, and she was learning how to use her wheelchair for different activities. And they needed me to come in and help out while she was making cookies in her wheelchair. So she needed to, kind of problem solve, like, all right, you washed your hands. Now are you going to touch your wheels when you wash your hands? How do you move from, the cookies from the oven to the table? Where do you need to place your wheelchair to be in a position to open up the door? Do you have the gloves and things with you to be able to pull the baking sheet out of the oven? And it was really cool to help support her as she's problem solving these, and she's learning. We're having this like cool relationship, and we worked on navigating different strategies for her to get the cookies out of the oven and put them on the table. And then we go to frosting cookies, and they were little cookies. So I'm trying to hold it in my left hand, and they're too tiny for me to hold in my left hand for me to then be able to spread the frosting on top of them. I was dropping them, and then she was laughing at me. And it was just so fun to be like, yes, we're making these cookies together, and neither one of us are really people who are doing this in a quote typical fashion. So that was
Mm-hmm.
such a magical moment that I was like, what is this job called? What is this a thing that people can do? And as I was finding and really researching what occupational therapy was, it was a lot on adaptations and strategies. And I was like, oh, that's me. Like, I do adaptations every day. I have to find different strategies to do things with my hand. And then thinking that it is a lot of movement, that you do get to create sessions based on what people care about. And I did have a tough time with that too when I was working in the schools. I felt like I was really trying so hard to convince 14-year-olds that they needed to do their geometry homework, and they just like were not interested. And I was like, I get it. But here I really enjoyed that these are things that are really that occupational therapy at its best are things that are really motivating for that individual person to do and want to get to do, and get to
Mm-hmm.
practice. Like the goal of that occupational therapy session was to have her learn how to use her wheelchair, but you could do that doing any different things. And so we got to pick an
Mm-hmm.
activity that she was really excited with. She picked what the activity was. It didn't really matter what the
Mm-hmm.
activity was as long as it was something that she wanted to do. And then the wheelchair navigating learning happened almost like by accident, I mean, it was intentionally
Mm-hmm.
placed, but that's not what she thought the goal of the activity was. She's like, wow, OT is great. I got to make cookies. Um, and just thinking that is so fun. And then just really loving that as somebody who identifies within the disability community, that I am also in a position where I'm a healthcare provider, and that there's unfortunately like a disconnect between people who are providers and then the people who are receiving services. So even sometimes some of the messaging in my program was very much like us versus them. And I feel like it didn't open up enough spaces that it's like, well, what if we are them? Like we can be both them, the people of the disability community that receive services, but also people within the disability community can be the people that are giving services as well. So in like a side mission, I'm really excited that more people who identify within the disability community become healthcare providers and healthcare leaders, and can really help change the shape of what healthcare looks like, because we're the ones who are living in our bodies and are the ones that are needing these adaptations. So it's really helpful. And I think we provide really lovely spaces for helping to make healthcare better, right? Like I think we hope to strive to make everything better, right? And I just truly
Exactly.
believe that people with disabilities need to be in those spaces where decisions are being made about them too.
Yeah, it's very important. And it goes along the line of the conversation we were having when we have to do the briefing for
Mm-hmm.
someone that may be blind or um, hard of hearing or whatever the difference may be. When we have to do our briefing, how can I help you? Not
Mm-hmm.
automatically assume that they cannot do for themselves.
Correct. Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, why was the decision to put your thumb a thing? Is it because even if without the four fingers, we can still
Mm-hmm.
be very functional with our thumb? Is that the reason behind it? Okay.
Yes,
All right.
my
So that's why the
thumb
thumb.
existed. Mhm. Yeah, I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
Yes, my thumb existed the way that I have understood it, and the way that it was described to me based on how I remember it from being a child, is that my thumb was more on the same plane as my pointer finger. So if somebody who does have all of their fingers, there's a moment where if you can bring your thumb up, almost like you can put your hand flat on the ground, that is the position that my thumb was fixed in, and my thumb was attached to the rest of my palm with skin. So right next to it, as if you were putting your hand down on the table. Yeah, so right next to it, that's how my thumb was attached. And I had a little tiny bit of separation, maybe like a centimeter of separation from my thumb and the rest of my palm. And my thumb is a tiny bit longer than my pinky, which is right next to it. So I do remember as a child, like trying to pick stuff up with my palm. So maybe like the handle of a tiny bucket if I'm playing on the sandbox, or like any
Mm-hmm.
type of loop of something. I would try to pick it up with my thumb, or I would just loop my whole hand into, if I have like a larger pail, then I would put my whole hand into
Mm-hmm.
it. The idea with my thumb is that they surgically separated it away from my palm and then put it into a little bit more of a position. This is called thumb, I believe this is thumb adduction and abduction, so that I have more of a pinch that I can get, and it's a little bit stronger if it's in this under position to my pointer finger, so that I can be able to pick up slightly heavier objects. Whereas if it was next to me, more laterally, and I think that's more flexion and extension. And I could be mixing those movements up, and I apologize. I honestly should know better, so that's on me. Um, that is not as strong of a pinch, or is not as a functional of a pinch as if it were to
Okay.
be more in that position where your thumb's underneath your hand. So from that, this my thumb is very helpful being able to be separated. I can pinch things in my hand, my thumb. I can hold on to different things in my thumb. And I do find that separation to be really helpful. And I remember being really excited when I was 5 and started using my thumb, that I felt like I was able to do lots more with my hand than I did before it was separated from my palm.
Gotcha. How old were you when you had the second surgery? The first surgery was at 13 months. And how old was the second
Mm-hmm.
one?
5. I was 5 years old.
5. That's why you were so excited, because
Mm-hmm.
that's when you were able to move the thumb after that surgery, for
Mm-hmm.
when you had that surgery.
Yeah.
Got
And I was
it.
in
And you
kindergarten. I
mentioned about
started
your
like
toes.
coloring with my thumb. It was fun.
Oh, I see. Okay. That's why it was 5 years old. Got it. Now you mentioned your toes. So you
Mm-hmm.
have 10 toes, but they're all petite, I guess we can say?
I have 10 toes, 3 of which are petite.
Oh, just 3. Does it mess with your balance? It does.
That's
How
a
so? You were
great
wearing heels when we
question.
were working the trip.
I think
How
I
so?
just am stumbly. I think I'm a stumbly, bumbly person to begin with. I'm not sure if the feet, if missing the toes has that much of an effect on my balance. Um, if I am, so I am missing, let's see, on my right foot, it's my middle toe that's a little bit shorter. And then on
Okay.
my left foot, it's my middle and my ring toe that are smaller. So I still have my
Okay.
big toe, my pointer toe, and then my pinky
Oh,
toes.
okay. So maybe that's,
So, mhm.
I guess it's kind of
And then,
like a duck,
yeah, yeah. Um,
and it helps
there
with the
is
balance
the
already.
only time, yeah, maybe. The only time I have found myself being annoyed with my feet is I do yoga videos in the morning, and sometimes the yoga video will have us do a toe squat. So that's where you're kneeling and then your toes are on the ground, but your heels are up. And that just puts so much pressure on my big toes because my middle toes
Mm,
aren't there to help diffuse that pressure. So that
I
is
gotcha.
incredibly painful for me, and I don't like doing that. And that honestly has been the only thing that I've noticed being like, oh, wow, I guess this is because my toes are little. But other times it's like, they might get caught in my shoes. Um, but I wear flip flops. Sometimes if the flip flop band is wide, then it can kind of bump
Mm-hmm.
into one of my little toes and I can get like a little blister on it. But then I just don't get those flip flops.
Oh, okay. Okay. Because I was interested, and that's all part of the congenital limb difference, having your toes like that.
Yes, those were surgically created. So they took the bones from my toes and they put them in my hand. At birth, I had all of my toes, but when I
Got
was 13 months old, they took those bones. So had the surgery not have happened, I would have all of my toes, and they would be the appropriate ratio lengths as expected.
it. Okay. Okay. So when you were born, and I'm sorry if I have to make you repeat yourself, you
That's
were
okay.
born with all 5 of your fingers on your left hand?
I was born with all fingers on my right hand, and then on my left hand,
Okay.
I was born with like little knuckles.
Oh, the way we see it now, or no?
Mm-hmm.
They were
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
smaller. Okay.
Aside
Okay.
from
All right.
my thumb was attached at birth. Hmm.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Now, did mom know before you were born that this is what your hand was going to look out, or this was a discovery when you came out the wound?
This was a discovery when I came out, and my mom describes the event as like scary in that I
Mm-hmm.
was born and I had kind of a difficult delivery. My mom uh, says that the doctor doing the delivery apparently liked to deliver babies face down. I don't know what the advantage or disadvantage is of the orientation of the head on birth, but she described that
Mm-hmm.
he wanted me face down, but I was coming out face up. And so he tried to move
Mm-hmm.
me to then bring me out face down, and then I wiggled myself back to come out face up. And so there's a lot of this moving in trying to have the orientation. And my mom tells this story as finally just like screaming. She's like, you know, my baby wants to see the world, just get her out of me. And I feel like that's a good tagline as far as who I am as a person and what I like to do is that I did want to see the world when I came out, right? So I liked that story. And after that, my mom was very exhausted and everything hurt because of this whole movement thing that was happening.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then as soon as I was born, they saw my hand difference, but didn't tell my mom. They just took me. They took me into another room, is how I've understood it, and they did a variety of different tests on me, like more intense tests than the typical tests that they'll do for a child at delivery. So I had neurological testing, I had cardiac testing, I had like blood work done. They wanted to just see if there was any other type of thing that was happening in conjunction with my hand difference. But the doctors did not communicate any of this to my mom. So my mom was like, I don't know, I watched movies and I feel like you have a baby and then they bring it to you and you hold it. And she's like, I feel like I should be holding a baby right
Exactly.
now, but I'm not holding a baby and I don't know why. And my hand difference didn't come up on any ultrasounds. That's also technology of the 90s. So I don't know that it would have come
Mm-hmm.
up. Um, and so when they finally did deliver me to my mom, they're like, okay, she's fine. And my mom's like, I don't know what you mean by that. Why are you saying that kind of strange? And they said that, like, you know, all of this testing came back fine. She just has this thing. And my mom was just like, whatever, give her to me. And then later on, it sort of sunk in as to what this means. And my baby's hand is different. And why is it different? And what did I do? You know, that's the first thing that a lot of parents will think, like, oh, it's because I had that glass of wine and I shouldn't have, and people told me not to,
Mm-hmm.
but I did, or, you know, I ate that food, or I didn't exercise. Those are lots of things that parents will very easily think of, and that's documented in research. That's tons of conversations that I've had with parents, and my own mom had those feelings too. But there's no research as of yet that supports that any of those claims are true. Lots of things happen, and it's also amazing to think about how many things do happen and how many babies are born and there aren't things that are different. Like I think that that's miraculous in of itself. Um, so yes.
Very interesting. Now, moving on to, as we are winding down,
Mm-hmm.
I want you to say, what did you say DD stand for again? Developmental
Delays, I think is maybe the word that I used.
delays. Delays. So, what I want you to, because we started having this conversation about people, what was the word you use, over glorifying a disability? What did you call it?
Ooh, yeah. Inspiration porn.
Inspiration porn. So I want you to educate
Mm-hmm.
the listeners on what is inspiration porn because that was new to me. I definitely
Yeah.
understand when you said glorifying a disability. I didn't even know it had a name to it. Um, Also,
Mm-hmm.
I want you to also, I guess that's all along the lines when people automatically feel sorry for people with disabilities. Does that all fall under the line of inspiration porn? So I want you to talk to us about that and give us a little mini education on the pros and cons of that and how we as uh, people who, I guess what's the correct term for me to use? People without developmental delays?
Or
Is there a
people that
correct
I
term?
identify with disability or don't. These are all great questions, and is so
Mm-hmm.
much of the things that I love to think about and talk like read about. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
yes, there is this whole area of disability studies and disability pride that is so amazing and so incredible. And there is like a disability community that I had no idea existed for a long time. And a lot of people don't. If we think about the history of disability within the United States, oftentimes people with disabilities, um, di- let me back up. In the United States, early time, if we're thinking about farmers and small communities, um, people with disabilities existed, and they would be
Mm-hmm.
farmhands. They would engage in their sort of communities, at least from what I understand, pretty decently. They were pretty well accepted in their families and in their communities. But then when we started heading into like the Industrial Revolution, where so much time and pressure was put onto productivity, where people then started moving to cities and building cities and needing to get jobs in factories, and people needed to do like a certain amount of screwing this thing on this thing in this conveyor belt, that people with disabilities are naturally, we take time to do things the way that we do them. So we were not helpful, if we will, in the workforce. And then were removed
Mm-hmm.
from the workforce. And then it became all of this sort of like money centric spaces where people with disabilities weren't able to have jobs. So then they weren't able to pay for their housing. So then they became dependent on other people to take care of them. And then other people may
Mm-hmm.
not have had the money to take care of them. So then they were put into institutions. And so then they were just removed from our society and really
Mm-hmm.
put in these spaces where there wasn't an expectation for them to be to contribute in any ways. They became dependents and recipients of things, and then they were in spaces where there wasn't a lot of like enrichment activities. So then they're not like growing and learning and thinking. Whereas, regardless of what the disability was, had they been in spaces where they did have activities that promoted learning and discovery and movement, then they would be able to contribute far more, right? But we
Mm-hmm.
didn't, as a society, provide them those spaces, um, even to degrees where like we were forced sterilizing people with disabilities in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with people that had intellectual disabilities. There's a Supreme Court case. It's called Buck versus Bell, and I believe it was in Virginia. And this was a case where Carrie Buck was she was forced sterilized or going into forced sterilization, and there's like actual like quotes in there from the whoever the court was on why we need to sterilize people, and that there's this quotes that says like 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, like we don't need these people in our society anymore. So I know that in American history, we think of the events that were happening, of like the genocide and the euthanization, that was happening in Germany and sort of like Nazi time periods. That same thought was also coming in the United States. So there's even a quote from a person here that was a researcher that was working with people that were engaging these things in that sort of like Germany landscape, that said like, "Oh, Hitler's beating us at our own game," and I was just like, "What?" So we come from these spaces in the like early 1900s where disability is now completely removed from our everyday society. We don't see them, so we think that there's not that many of them, and then we have this
Mm-hmm.
perception that people with disabilities aren't doing things or aren't helpful or can't contribute. Instead, they're just these recipients, dependents on care. They're, soaking up welfare, social security, yada, yada, yada.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and thinking like that's not even that long ago. I mean, we're talking 100 years, um,
Yeah.
or like, I'm sorry, that's yes. So it is just really fascinating in that way. And then, so sort of in light of that, there is this like massive stigma on people with disabilities. And we have all these assumptions as far as what we think people can and can't do that identify within the disability community. And there's a whole theory that's called stigma theory that was written by a sociologist in the 60s that talks about that it's like people who don't identify with disability just make all of these assumptions on people who do identify with disability, and we put them on a lower social level. And
Mm.
we don't think of them as being equals in our society. So then as we head towards the like late 90s, and we head towards the like early 2000s, even in the 70s, there's like a big movement that was happening as far as disability pride goes. And this is happening very shortly after the civil rights movements that were happening. And a lot of the same language written in the 504 is what it's called. It's the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, I think. Is a document that provides the civil rights for individuals with disabilities, and it's using a lot of the same language that was in the civil rights movement's legislature that gave us legal protections that we couldn't discriminate against disability. But even with that, it wasn't until the 90s that the ADA was passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, that made it a requirement to have public buildings be accessible. And even with that,
Mm.
things aren't even that much accessible, but thinking that stairs are pretty significant barriers for people who navigate the world with a variety of different mobility aids. And that's the 90s. Like the 90s also wasn't that long ago. Um,
No.
so then we're kind of in that space. We're like, okay, sure, maybe now we have buildings are a little bit more accessible. Now maybe we're interacting with a tiny bit more people with disabilities in our communities, but still like a large part of the world isn't accessible. And because we're not seeing it in our movies, we're not seeing it in our books, we're not seeing it in any of our spaces where we're consuming and learning how the world works, we just assume that it's not there. So we then
Mm-hmm.
develop this pity for people with disabilities because we're not seeing them, we're not hearing their stories. The stories that we do hear or that we are learning about them aren't written by people who identify within the community. They're stories that are being made
Mm-hmm.
about them and put on them, and we put them in these boxes in these spaces. So that's sort of where that those themes of like pity or less than or even like decreased
Mm-hmm.
expectations as to what people can or can't do. Um, in
Mm-hmm.
my very first day being a flight attendant, I was flying with a guy who was maybe like a month senior to me, and he saw my hand and he asked me how I got this job. I was like, I don't know. We went through the same training. I was able to open
Wait a
up all
minute,
the same
girl.
doors. I wouldn't have made training had I not been here, you know?
He did what? Wait, Sarah. He really had
Yeah.
the audacity on the trip that you two were working together. Let's say it was a 2, 3, 4 day trip. He,
Hmm.
in his right mind, had no respectable way of approaching you to talk to you. But the first thing he said is, "How did you get this job?"
Yes.
Now, immediately
Yes.
at that moment, you could have had this fool lose his job. Are you kidding me?
Yeah. Yeah. And this happens. Like these are everyday conversations that I encounter.
I'm sorry to cut you
Yeah.
off. I just feel like
That's okay.
something like that isn't appropriate for a 5 year old who doesn't have the common sense and logical. You know how I was telling you when the kids were little, they
Hmm.
would stare at people because they look different, and you, as the parent, have to, no, you do not do that. Kalia, Khalif, don't do that. And then they would look at me,
Hmm.
Mommy, what's wrong with that person? And you would have to talk with them. You are a grown ass man. And this is the way you feel as though you need to approach a conversation with something that you don't understand. Ugh. Okay, go ahead. Continue, Sarah. It just bothers
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, and and even thinking about that, like my limb difference is kind of on the beginning spectrum of disability, if we consider disability a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
where like I'm pretty like quote able-bodied to do a lot of things. And this is the reaction that people have to me. And it's the same reaction that people have to people that are within the disability community. We all complain that
Mm-hmm.
these are things that are happening. And that goes back to that we haven't been visible in the workforce. We haven't been visible in movies. And when we are, it's this very tragic story that's being told, and we're ones to be pitied.
Mm-hmm.
People with disabilities then oftentimes were on the streets needing money because they couldn't work these jobs because they weren't fast, or they they couldn't work at the
Mm-hmm.
speed of people who maybe had both of their hands or whatever, could stand on a conveyor belt, etc. And that doesn't mean that they can't contribute or they can't be involved or they don't want to work. It's that the opportunities that are available aren't designed for people with our bodies. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so we have like that element, which really perceives disability in a bad light and really puts us as a lower, less than um, body of people, if we will. And
Mm-hmm.
so many times people have said, like, oh, well, no one would want your, like, I had another flight attendant tell me, well, no one would want your hand. And like, I feel like that's a very strange thing to say. I don't know why we need to talk about wanting or not wanting my hand, but the fact that like this is a very largely negative quality perceived trait to have to be a part of the disability community.
Now,
And then
Sarah,
on the flip side, people, yes, tell me.
you are very capable of handling your own. Do you respectfully say something to them to bring knowledge to them? And, and for those of you who don't understand, being a flight attendant have its own difficulties. The difficult part of the job for me is not knowing who you're going to encounter at work, the different personalities that you have to deal with. You go to your Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. You know Billy, Sally, Susan, Sam, John, Tasha. You're seeing these people every day. You know their personalities.
Mm-hmm.
You know on Mondays, John is not nice at all. But Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, he's good. Friday, he's super happy because it's the weekend. We're not dealing with the same people every day. So that is the scariest part of our job. But how do you respectfully deal with the ignorance of these human beings who should know better and do better? And then to find sanity for the remaining of the trip.
Yes. Oh, such great questions. And it depends. Largely, I do things like this where I try to talk more about the stories and share the things that I've learned in spaces here, so that hopefully people are learning things. So then, when they do encounter people that are different, they're like, "Oh yeah, I know this is something that exists," and that's really all that we
Mm-hmm.
need. Um, but then when I'm interacting with people like that on the trip, I really try to read it. Like, is this somebody I'm trying to make friends with? Is this like, do I have the energy to do this today or not? And that will really
Yes.
depend. Like, even if I were to say anybody, is this person going to be receptive, or are they just going to keep nagging? That we use these words I try to be really mindful of that. And then especially if they're talking about a passenger or somebody else or other people within the disability community, I really try to, I will redirect the conversation to be like, actually, this is updated terminology. This is updated language. These are people within the disability community. These are the things that they do. These are their needs, etc. That I will really educate in those spaces. But when I first started at 23, I didn't. I would just cry. I would just go cry in the bathroom or in the hotel rooms. Like,
Oh.
there's also a story that was a pretty transformative moment for me. I was like 28, I think. And I was in my OT program and I was doing my clinical rotation. So I was maybe 2.5 years in my program. And I was at a bar in
Mm-hmm.
Chicago with the other OTs that were in the program with me as well. And we were all getting a drink. It was a Friday. We were very excited. And there's probably like 7 of us, and we're at this table. And then these guys come over, right, as that happens at bars. So this one guy, Mike, I believe was his name, he like slid himself down into the bar next to me, and he's chatting and whatever. And then he notices my hand, and he, no joke, asks me, "Were you born deformed?" And I just looked at him and I was like, "Excuse me, like, is deformed language that we want to use when we're talking about other people? Like, what's another word that you could use instead?" And he was just like, "Oh, what?" And I was like, "Let's try that again. Like, I don't think that's really what you meant to say." And then he was like, "Oh," so he couldn't think of anything, of course, and then was all confused as to why I'm acting like this, I suppose. And then I go in to say, like, yes, this is a congenital indifference. These are the words that I like to use. This is what this means. And then he asked me, "Oh, so is there anything else weird about your arm?" I was like, "Did we not learn from the first time? Like, weird isn't another word that we want to use to describe our body. Like, you clearly weren't paying attention the first time. And no, like, I'm done with this conversation. And then he like got all fumbly and then asked for my number. And I said, no. He's like, what do you mean you won't give it to me? I was like, Mike, this didn't go well for you. Like, I don't want your phone number. I have no interest in talking to you. You clearly have no respect for me. And then he left. And I was like really proud of myself because that was the first time that I had an interaction like that. Whereas otherwise, I would have just been crying in the bathroom and feeling bad for myself and, like, why does this happen and blah, blah, blah. But, and then I really, and in that moment, I was like, it's for my own self-respect, but also for every other person that has a limb difference. Like,
Exactly.
it's not Mike's fault that he's literally never met another person with a limb difference in his life, right? I don't know however old he was at that point, but it's not necessarily his fault he didn't meet anybody that was anything like me. But he also doesn't need to talk to me in that way. And that now we need to know that people like me exist and that we're out here living our lives, doing our thing, and we're not going to get called deformed at bars. Like, that's not an appropriate response for that. So I was just
And
thinking that there's all of these other people that are like that too. Yes.
and what I wanted to say is the insensitivity. So I I don't have compassion for him, but I can understand his ignorance and where he's coming from and why he's choosing to use these words because as you just said, Sarah, because maybe he just hasn't been surrounded around anybody with um a difference or a disability, but to be so insensitive, I feel like we grow up knowing right from wrong, being
Mm-hmm.
respectful, being mindful, and it's all about the delivery and the approach. Logically, he sees an attractive woman. You Something sparks your interest. Having interest, there's nothing wrong with that. But what you're telling me, young man, there is no other way you could have approached me. There is no other way you could have asked me your question because you're curious. It's okay to be curious, but you still need to
Mm-hmm.
remain respectful. You can't just say whatever you want to
Yes.
say with me and assume that I am supposed to be okay with every approach. That's the same thing if someone, was approaching me and say something like, I get it all the time. And this is not the same thing. But I do not like when
Mm-hmm.
people approach to me, when we're on the 321 with the larger bins
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and I'm using the sticks. One guy had
Mm-hmm.
the audacity to ask me, do you bring that on the job? Girl, do I bring that on the job? Like, are you kidding me? Do you just think that I'm just going around shopping around for something to close? And you don't want to be rude. I didn't say, all I said, I just looked at him in a way and I speak with my face. Thank God we're still wearing masks. You know, it comes with the aircraft, dude. And I just walked away. And this is me being just Shirley all day, Shirley, no smile on my face, no nothing, because that was just inappropriate to ask. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
comical. I've had people say to me, oh my God, that tool is great. I'll take that all day. But do you
Mm-hmm.
bring that
Mm-hmm.
on the job? The two do not match. He could have approached you
Correct.
respectfully and say, you know what, out of curiosity, I was just wondering, can can you just explain to me? Um, I, it, Even if he just was speechless, not knowing what to say, but I know you,
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, and you would have been more open to teach him and educate him at that moment instead of saying, is there any other part of your body that's deformed? Fuck you.
Right. I was like, I'm sorry, what?
Literally.
No. And then from that moment I was like, I'm done with this. Like, I have cried all the tears I have to cry and then some, and we're over it. And I'm tired of hiding myself, and I'm tired of like being panicky about what are people going to say? When are they going to say it? Like that is so much energy and time that I was exhausted. And that's incredibly exhausting. And to hide yourself and all of these pieces about who you are from the world is exhausting. And I know that there are so many people who have hidden themselves for whatever reasons, or, all of the reasons, not whatever, I'm not discrediting that, but people who have felt that they've needed to hide themselves because the world doesn't accept them. And then they've been liberated, and it's just like such an amazing, freeing feeling. And I know that, and I just want everyone to feel that. And I know that there are people still today that are hiding themselves, and just hope that it's so much better. And when you encounter these spaces where you are able to free yourself, and I totally believe that it's worth it. But I know that there's a long path of lots of things that need to be involved in that as well.
Thanks for tuning in to Fanpale Podcast. If you want to continue the conversation or share your takeaways, I want to hear from you. Head on over to the website or join our Facebook community and comment your favorite part of the show or share your thoughts. I want to hear what you have to say. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Chat with you next week.